Mickey 17 is a highly original new film from an award-winning director and a very talented cast. So, what's not to like? Well, I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I think science fiction is arguably at its best when it is probing existential questions and offering biting social commentary. And there is a theoretical version of Mickey 17 that succeeds at doing precisely that, leveraging its very high concept premise and unsettling dark comedy to explore provocative themes of mortality and social power. But I think while people often accuse, modern Hollywood of just being totally bankrupt of ideas, I think Mickey 17 suffers from just having far too many of them, because this is just not a good film. I did not resonate with this film at all. In fact, I think I'm hard pressed to think of a film that I've reviewed in the last several years that I probably disliked as much as this one. Because despite featuring plenty of creative talent and a very fascinatingly original concept, Mickey 17 is just an overstuffed, narratively disjointed, and kind of self-indulgent slog that is just never as funny, clever, or subversive as it seems to think it is. And as I alluded to in the intro, perhaps the most disappointing thing about Mickey 17 is its squandered potential, because director Bong Joon-ho earned an Academy Award for his previous film, Parasite, I think back in 2019, and actor Robert Pattinson has now fully rid himself of this stigma of merely being that sparkly vampire from Twilight. And the film's very compelling premise of a so-called expendable who can be reprinted over and over, allowing him to serve as some sort of scientific guinea pig in a very grim cycle of death and rebirth, is super interesting, and I think opens the doors to some intriguing philosophical and even theological dilemmas, such as what does cloning technology mean for the reality of a human soul. But the film is just way too easily, I think, sidetracked to ever fully walk through those open doors, choosing, I think, instead to bloat the runtime with just a bunch of shallow political satire and kinky sexual scenarios. And perhaps fitting given the plot of this movie, there are almost two different parallel movies in Mickey 17 that do attempt to sort of coexist together. Because the first and far superior version is the sort of dark comedy sci-fi story that is focused on Mickey's own point of view and his experiences. But the second is just a wearisome ham-fisted political satire, because with a very recognizable speaking cadence and red hat wearing followers and just obsession with media exposure, Mark Ruffalo's kind of egomaniacal politician character is clearly, unmistakably intended to be a sort of representation of Donald Trump. And obviously, political satire is fair game for any movie. I think some viewers, particularly political conservatives, may take offense to the portrayal. Personally, I don't really get bent out of shape or offended over that kind of thing, but it's just so over the top and one note here, almost beating audiences over the head with its very blunt, can't miss references, that the scenes just play out like an overlong and uninspired SNL political sketch that just quickly outstays its welcome. And kind of on that note, perhaps the biggest issue, at least for me, with Mickey 17 is that it is a mostly humorless comedy. It's a movie that has a very high concept plot, but then humor that only ever seems to aim at the very bottom of the gutter. For example, the Trump-inspired politician's wife, who's a very gratingly on-the-nose character of a so-called Karen, has a weird, bizarre obsession with making sauce for her cooking, and there's this absolutely nothing funny about that joke. And yet it is almost tediously just repeated over and over and over. And oftentimes the humor is merely just to have a character deliver a very long F-bomb filled diatribe with the only punchline seeming to be that, the character said a lot of swear words, which is funny, I guess. I think kind of between the profanity and the sex, really all the humor in this movie seems designed to shock and unsettle audiences, but it's just delivered with such almost unrelentingly uninspired repetitiveness that kind of any intended impact is lost. I will say that the film is far more successful when it does focus on the character of Mickey himself. I think kind of Robert Pattinson's accent in this is a bit weird and will probably be a divisive creative choice. but there is an almost like tragic charm to the character. And I do think sort of the dynamic of essentially having like a split personality that's embodied in like multiple physical versions of himself is very like fascinating fodder for a character study. Yet even here, the film just can't stay focused. I think rather than explore the more like compelling aspects of a dehumanized character that's willingly subjugated to repeatedly die, it instead just chooses over and over to linger more on like imagining sort of the icky sexual implications. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, there's a lot really across the board. For language, I did not get like an exact count, but there's heavy profanity all throughout, including a bombardment of like f-bombs, seemingly like in every scene. For violence, despite being a movie about a character who has to like repeatedly die, there's nothing really overly graphic, because Mickey, he dies in sort of various like unfortunate but mostly bloodless ways. Probably the most, you do see a man that has his hand cut off, and then you see like the severed appendage sort of shown floating through space, and another character who is seemingly chopped up with a chainsaw, although the actual chopping happens off screen. For sexuality, there is a lot going on in this film. There are two explicit like sexual scenes featuring like nude or semi-nude characters, although I think like most of like the crucial like bodily bits remain covered. But you have a man who like cups a woman's breast with his hand and then like later puts his head kind of between her legs to perform oral sex. In a later scene, a woman and like two clones of the same man who are all clothed or mostly clothed began to engage in a very icky threesome featuring like foreplay and the woman ultimately like putting her hand down the front of the man's pants. Throughout the movie too, Mickey, like when he is reprinted, is printed being nude, and in one scene he does like fall out of the printer like onto the ground, exposing sort of his bare backside. And just sort of overall, like, the space sort of colonizing mission at the heart of this film involves like a planned breeding program to like populate the new planet, which leads to like frequent crude talk about sex. There is one kind of romantic couple that kind of all throughout sort of brainstorm like using stick figure diagrams, like the various sexual positions to like experiment on with each other. One other kind of content thing that comes to mind is that this film does offer what I took to be a very like cynical view of religion, seemingly sort of a mixture of like American evangelicalism and like Scientology, where the church is sometimes spoken of as like the company. But you have characters that like pray and like sing praises to God, although they are clearly like insincere and merely using like the religious rhetoric as part of their own like manufactured public persona, or just like as a means to control people. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface of this, arguably the main message in this film is Donald Trump is bad, but I think kind of that pointed critique does unfold under like kind of the larger umbrella of some more interesting themes just about sort of the nature of power and oppression. Because in most sort of like sci-fi narratives, oppression typically comes from like external forces or like a tyrannical empires. But I do think kind of like interestingly in Mickey 17, it seems like everyone almost like willingly signs up for their own oppressive circumstances, because Mickey, he enrolls out of his own free will into the Expendables program, although like some of his external circumstances do much to like lead him to that point. And then like the crew itself of this colonizing mission are not being like coerced, but rather like almost like zealously are following, the dominating politician out of their own free will. And when it comes to like our own real world cultural circumstances, the film seems to suggest that like we've done this to ourselves, and then like ask viewers to examine their own kind of like personal culpability in the division and anger and like dehumanization that does seem to like permeate modern culture. One other kind of quick thing that there's sort of another interesting subtext kind of throughout this film, just in the way that like characters approach the prospect of death. Because for most of the characters, death is a very fearful and like uncertain experience. And while he like, obviously doesn't enjoy dying, only Mickey seems to have found any kind of real peace about death, since, as another character notes, he has hope of being reborn. So I think in a film that seems to frequently kind of criticize religion, it is interesting to me that peace is clearly shown to like only be found in like assurance of life after death. So in the end, movies and humor are somewhat subjective, but clearly I did not resonate with this film at all. I think for me, Mickey 17 is just a sort of like cinematic exercise in excess. It's a film that I do expect will probably garner some sort of like critical acclaim, especially from critics who perhaps like align with its very strong political viewpoints. But at least to me, it's just way too disjointed and humorless to please audiences looking for more than just sort of that base level catharsis of political affirmation. I think the film should be commended for taking a bold and like ambitious swing for the fences at a time where very risk averse Hollywood typically like opts to play it safe. And there are times here or there where the grim humor and like social commentary does work. But I think kind of like the reprinted Mickey, too often the same one-note jokes and like simplistic satire beats are resurrected over and over only to be completely beaten to death. I think with like an overlong 2-hour, 20-minute runtime, I myself started to feel almost like an expendable, just sort of trapped in an endless cycle of misery. But hey, I would love to hear what you thought, whether you agree with me or you completely disagree with me on this film. Don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide with your world for Christ.